Good morning. My name is David Keller. I'm director of the Center for the Study of Ethics. It's my honor to welcome you to the Center for the Study of Ethics Conference by the Faculty keynote address this year by our University Faculty Fellow in Ethics for the previous academic year, Laura Hamlin. The purpose of the University Faculty Fellowship in Ethics is to facilitate faculty scholarship in interdisciplinary ethics. Laura Hamlin achieved this in spades by spending last academic year in Amman, Jordan, interviewing refugees displaced by the Iraqi war. Laura is an associate professor at Utah Valley University, where she has taught for over 11 years. She received her PhD in creative writing and poetry from the University of Denver. Before coming to UVU, she taught for a year at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She teaches poetry, creative writing, women's literature, composition, and at times seminars on various authors, including William Blake and Martin Buber. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Laura Hamlin.
Thank you so much for coming. Whether you're here because your teacher, like I, is giving you extra credit for being here, or whether you're interested in the topic, I appreciate your attendance. And I'd also like to thank the Ethics Center for the Faculty Fellowship, Dave Keller and the Ethics Center. I also need to thank former Dean Bill Cobb of the School of Humanity and Social Science, and my department chair, Robert Cousins, for allowing me to take the sabbatical for my research, and the current dean, David Yells, and again, my chair, for their continued support of my research. And I'd like to thank my dear friends and colleagues, Don Levange for publicity, and Deb Thornton for helping me put together the PowerPoint. And I'm a bit of a Luddite, so if I stumble, well, there's an explanation, whatever. I'll begin with a description of my project. I went to Amman, Jordan I was there for 11 months, and I gathered oral histories of Iraqi women refugees. And I was interested in this topic of research because I teach women's lit. I'm very interested in women's issues, and I'm also part of the faculty that put together the Peace and Justice Studies program here at UVU. And so I was able to sort of merge these two interests and with this research. Okay, let's see. Jordan. Jordan has a population, it's a small country, it has a population of 5.5 million people. And the median income for a Jordanian is equal to 375 United States dollars a month. They're a very water poor country. In fact, per capita, they have the least amount of water per capita of any nation in the world. There are essentially no natural resources. There's no gas, there's no lumber, there's no minerals. And so most of their income is based on tourism. And they've also been a traditional ally of the United States. Now, they're not a democracy, they're a kingdom. And that's probably important to keep in mind, too. Here we see Jordan. It's the little orange-yellow country right next to pink Israel. Iraq is to the east, then Iran further to the east, and then you see Afghanistan. It is bordered by Saudi Arabia on the south, Israel on the west, and Syria on the north. This is a picture of Amman from my apartment window. The entire capital is made from these limestone blocks. It's very beautiful. They have their own twin towers coming up. Different pictures of Amman. And you'll see this. This is Bedouins living in the middle of town. The tent is right there in the middle, and their camels grazing. And here's a Bedouin girl tending her goats. More Bedouin. This is part of the tourism. You can pay a Bedouin to go stay in the tent overnight, which I did, and it was great fun. And then the Dead Sea, my sisters and I are demonstrating that we're doing synchronized swimming, demonstrating you can float. There's some amazing ancient Christian churches there with probably the best preserved mosaic floors. And this is a very famous map of Jerusalem. And then Petra, one of the 7 wonders of the world. This tourism is really the basic income for Jordanians. I need to begin with a definition of refugees. In 1951, the UN Convention defined a refugee as a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, nationality, membership of a particular group or political opinion, is outside of his country of nationality and is unable, or owing to such fears, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. This is a very important document which Jordan did not sign at the time. You see, it's 1951, and just prior to this time, as Israel took over parts of Palestine, there was a big wave of Palestinian refugees into Jordan, and they had a difficult time accommodating them financially. So they did not sign this convention. And what this means is that Iraqis are received not as refugees with the rights and privileges that are afforded by the United Nations definition, the international rights, but they're received as temporary visitors, and they may stay there for 3 months, at which time they're either expected to move on or to become residents. Now, the way one becomes a resident of Jordan is by depositing the equivalent of 75,000 American dollars in a frozen Jordanian account, or by investing $50,000 in a Jordanian country. This is a lot of money for anyone. It's particularly a lot of money for refugees. The refugees came basically in 3 waves. The first wave were people who were quite wealthy and who got their families out of Iraq before the war began, knowing that there would be trouble. My translator is one of these people. She was able to become a resident accordingly. The second wave of refugees were people who were fleeing for safety and protection, but they had the money to get out. Many of these people were professionals. And then the final group are people who were just running for their lives. They basically sold everything they had, or everything was taken from them, and they came without any possessions. Now, most Iraqis have difficulty renewing their visas, and so after this 3-month period, so this results in a lack of legal status, which has a number of complicated implications accordingly. One is that once they lose their legal status, they are not allowed to work in Jordan unless they're a resident. And so the majority of the Iraqis, it's illegal for them to work. Well, how are they going to support themselves? And I'll address that in a little bit. Here's a pie chart Deb helped me with, which shows where, now there's it's probably closer to 5 million at this point, Iraqi refugees and displaced people. A displaced person is a person who has left their home, has fled from their home for safety, same reasons as a refugee would leave, but they stay in their country of origin. And about half of the close to 5 million people are displaced people, and the other half are refugees. And this shows where the various countries are, and the percentage of refugees in each country. And you see, Jordan only has 17%. I originally wanted to go to Syria, and my father, who is 82, said he forbade me to go. So you got to obey Dad, right? So I went to Jordan. Okay, The refugees leave Iraq for a number of reasons. The first reason is that their lives are threatened. And with all of the secular violence that has taken place and the upheaval of and sort of the vying of power for different political fractions, many people were killed. Many people were kidnapped or had family members kidnapped and tortured. And their lives truly were threatened. Another is that their property was taken over. Now, during the reign of Saddam, one thing that's significant is he ran a secular state. And so the Sunni Shia issues were really not forefront during his reign. And Sunnis married Shias and vice versa, and they lived in neighborhoods with this multiple population. But with all of the secular violence, you might live in a mixed neighborhood, and then one or the other parties begins to gain power and chases the other party members out and then takes over their homes. And so when their property's taken over, you know, they can't really go back and just say, but here's my title. This is Hala Al-Sarraf. She's the beautiful Hala. She's my translator, and she's an amazing woman. She's a Fulbright scholar from Columbia, and she has an advanced degree in public health policy. And she formed her own non-government organization called Iraq Health Access, in which, this is amazing, what she's done is she takes Iraqi war widows and puts them through a 3-month training program in affiliation with hospitals in Baghdad. And they basically train them to be nurses. It's more like an LPN, but then they give them, these women, the equipment they need to open their own little clinic in their homes, and these women function as primary health caregivers. And when there's an emergency situation, when there's curfew, you know, they're able to sustain life. If someone's bleeding to death or whatnot, they're able to sustain life until they're able to get to a hospital. And she has, of date, graduated 600 war widows into this program, which is an amazing thing, because a widow in Arabic countries is sort of low, the low of the low on the socioeconomic scale. And so she's given them status, a way to provide for themselves and their families, and respect in the community. It's a wonderful thing she's doing. Here are her kids. Noor, the daughter, is a medical doctor herself. Musa is, he's my Habibti. Habibi, sorry. And Zayn is the older brother. Kind of looks like your family bickering, right? Pulling each other's hair. Okay, these are the demographics of the women that we worked with. And half the women we interviewed worked outside of their homes while they lived in Iraq. We have a great diversity in socioeconomic classes. Some of the women included attorneys, a PhD in Islamic law, medical doctor, political cartoonist, an engineer, a designer of fabric, a chemist, veterinarian, math teacher, PE teacher, nursery school teacher, educational research, a news anchor woman, the woman who's sort of be the equivalent of Katie Couric of Iraq, and cigarette saleswomen. And these are women who have really no social status, and they sit on the corner and sell cigarettes. And one of the women that I interviewed, who was a cigarette saleswoman, she had worked in the Ministry of Education during Saddam's reign. They have various marital status, including women who are wives, polygamous wives, widows, unmarried women. And 43% of the female refugees have a college degree. This is a very educated population. That's way above the United States standards. And the religious affiliations of the various women we interviewed included Shia, Sunni, Christian, and Sabian. And the Sabians are sometimes known as Baptists. It's a mixture of Christian, Muslim, and Zoroastrianism, and their main prophet is John the Baptist. Okay. I'm going to go through some of the stories of the women we interviewed. This woman, has a very tragic tale. And these little, we had a project where we were distributing, what are these called? Luddite. I knew someone would know how to fix that. You just did that to give me a heart attack, right? Okay. We were distributing space heaters for the women. It's bitter cold in Jordan in the winter, and most of the houses, the apartments these women were living in were made of cement, and it just retains the heat and the cold and the moisture. But this woman, she lived as a princess while she was in Iraq. Her family worked with the inner circles of Saddam's regime, and in fact, her father and her husband and her brother-in-laws and her brother, all of them worked for the intelligence agency of Saddam, which means they were the ones who were, capturing, torturing, investigating, and executing people that Saddam disapproved of. But she lived in this massive, wealthy home. Everything she needed was provided for. Servants of every kind waited on her. And when Saddam's regime failed, a lot of people felt like it was time to get even, right? And so the males in her family were certainly sought after. One day, a stranger came to her door and said, "Are you the wife of so-and-so?" And she said, "Yes." And he left a garbage bag on the doorstep. And when she opened it up, there were human body parts in it. And she and her sisters took out 37 different human body parts and put them together like a puzzle, and it was her husband. And she really has, it was very obvious interviewing her that she's mentally unstable. She had what we call inappropriate affect, which is a person who laughs at inappropriate situations. She'd be telling these stories and giggling, And additionally, when she came to Jordan, she had a baby, and she claims that her husband, that she became pregnant before the baby died, before her husband died. So the baby looks much older than she claims it to be, and it's of lighter skin tone than her other children. So everyone knows that she's had this baby out of wedlock, which is a very shameful thing in that culture. The floor was absolutely soggy, and the couch there that we were sitting on would rumple periodically and was full of mice. I counted 8 mice as I was interviewing. For every mouse you see, there's it's supposed to be 10 others or something. Very, very sad situation. This woman was one of the Sabians, and her husband was actually kidnapped during the Iran-Iraq War by the Iranians and forced to become a Muslim, including circumcision. And he was gone for 7 years. And he escaped and came back. She's a PE teacher, or she was in Iraq. The Sabians are... there's a lot of prejudice against the Sabians. In many ways, they're perceived as the way the Jews during the Middle Ages in Europe were perceived of. They tend to be very good with money. They're jewel makers and do fine gold work. And she told me when they came here to Jordan, her husband can't find work. They're living off meager savings, and some family members send them money. But there's a lot of tension, of course, in a family when you're under that type of stress and anxiety and pressure. And she said, my husband comes home, and he's angry and upset, and he yells at me, and I'm angry and upset, and I yell at the children, and they're upset and yell at each other. She said, my house is continually full of stress. And she said, we never used to be that way. She said, we were always a very loving and careful family with one another. Now, it's interesting that she would admit to this. I'm quite certain everyone that we interviewed has experienced, essentially everyone has experienced similar types of stress, but she actually spoke of it. And the United Nations has done some research, and instances of domestic violence have increased among the population of refugees. Another sad tale, this woman is a war widow. She has 4 young daughters, and no way to provide for them. It's often the case, all right, when an Iraqi refugee works illegally, there's always the fear that the immigration officers are going to find out and deport him. And so often the women will work illegally because it tends to be the case that the immigration officers will be less likely to approach and interrogate a woman than a man. And so they can sometimes get away with working illegally a little bit easier. But in addition, a lot of people will send their children to work. These 2 older daughters, who are actually 14 and 13, they look quite a bit more mature than that. They worked illegally, and they worked as caterers and servers for wedding parties. And so they would go to these 5-star hotels and serve. And immigration officers would come by, and they said they would dive under the tables where the guests are sitting and hide until they were told to come out again. Now, the wedding parties typically go from 6 o'clock to 1, 2, 3 in the morning. They're very, very big social events. And these little girls, the taxis aren't driving, the public transportation's not driving. Excuse me, there are taxis, but they can't afford a taxi. The buses aren't running. And so these little girls walk home alone at night, and men will follow them and harass them. And when the girls were telling me their story, they said, they say things that aren't nice. That's as, typically the Muslim women are very modest, socially reserved, and so, it would embarrass them to speak more frankly than that about the harassment. But think about it, 13 and 14 years old. How likely is it that these little girls can ward off sexual predators at that late at night? And the men follow them to their homes. They know where they live. This is Eva. She was a Christian woman, and she and her daughter, who was 9 years old, were kidnapped. And they were held for ransom. And most of the kidnappings were just people wanted money. I mean, the economic system was basically shattered and flattened with with the overthrow of Saddam. So she and her daughter were kidnapped. And she said that they were held in a house for 3 days. And for 3 days, she was continually beaten and raped. And her daughter, she could hear her in another room crying for 3 days, basically crying, "Mommy, Mommy, help me." And she didn't say what specifically was done to her daughter, but I think it would be very naive of any of us to assume that she wasn't also raped. Eva at the time was 7 months pregnant, and she ended up losing that baby. And I think that one of the reasons she spoke frankly of this sexual abuse is there's a little bit of a different perception between Christians and Muslims about rape. Now, this is my own theory, so, for what it's worth. It seems to me that the Muslim culture is a shame-based culture, and they will control people through the possibility of shame. And shame for them is much more significant than it is for Western people. I think we are a guilt-based culture. And so we are controlled through the various institutions in our culture to behave, if you will, by the possibility of guilt. And so as a Christian, her husband didn't perceive of her as being immoral or loose by being raped, and she was able to speak more freely of it. But, rape is always a part of war. Always a part of war. The women don't speak of it freely, but it is there behind everything they do. And according to Western psychology, when you hold this back and repress it, the anxiety is going to manifest in other ways, of course, until a woman works at dealing with that. Interesting family here. There's Hala with the glasses. This family, the husband isn't there. The wife is in the tiger scarf in the very back. And of these children, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children, 3 of them are deaf mutes. They were born deaf and mute. Her husband worked for the equivalent of the MTV in Iraq. He made music videos, and which is sort of ironic with 3 of his children being deaf mutes. They are from Basra, which is the south of Iraq, and the British were controlling the southern Iraq, as opposed to the Americans, but they refer to them as Americans. They just see all of the military as American. And so the boys were telling me their stories. I said, what do you remember about Iraq? And because they're deaf mutes, they were pantomiming their stories, and then their sister was translating it. And the 2 boys, the one in the red jacket and the one in the back with the black sweater that has a stripe on it, they were out in public on the streets, and a lot of people were gathering, and there's sort of, some rumbling started, and it looked like there might be, a show of protest. And a couple rocks were thrown, and the British soldiers said, that's it, everyone clear the streets, clear the streets. And everyone cleared the streets except these 2 boys, and they were shot. And both of them were shot in the leg, and one of them was shot in the shoulder, and I saw their bullet wounds, and luckily they weren't killed. And of course, when the British soldier found out that they were deaf mutes, they felt terrible, but these are just some of the unintended consequences of war that inevitably are going to happen. And the video I took of him pantomiming this story, the throwing of the shells and the soldiers and so forth, it's quite shocking. When I showed my friends, I stayed for 9 months at what's called the American Center of Oriental Research. It's like a hostel for scholars who are studying, mainly archaeologists actually. But I was showing this video clip to my colleagues there, and there were 5 of them, and 3 of them got up and left the room in tears. They couldn't bear to watch. It's also interesting, these boys believed that when the soldiers came, they believed that all the soldiers were deaf mutes because they would talk to them in sign language. Isn't that a sort of a strange and wonderful misperception? These 2 women also have a sad tale. The older woman had been married for 11 years and had been unable to conceive. And so her husband ended up marrying the second woman who's in bed, and she is the cousin of the first. And the second wife had this little daughter, and then she became pregnant again. She was bleeding severely, and the doctor gave her some hormones and told her, flat bed rest, you can't do anything. So there she is in the bed in the bitter cold. You can see she's just piled up with coats and blankets and scarves and so forth. And they didn't have the money. The doctor gave them the medication for a month, and then he said, you're going to go have to buy this medicine. And it was quite expensive, $80 a month. Terribly expensive for them. And as I heard their story, my first impulse was to offer to pay for the medication for this woman. And my second impulse was, I thought, what am I doing? These people are peasants. They have no education. They have no way to support themselves. It's this moral dilemma, an ethical dilemma, where no matter what you do, it seems wrong. And these types of moral dilemmas presented themselves over and over and over again. There were no easy black and white answers or resolutions or solutions for problems. This woman was from the north. She's actually a Kurd, but she's a war widow herself, and she felt that it was safer for her to wear the complete burqa or the abaya, fully scarved, because she would be less harassed. This is one of my favorite women, Ibtisam, but this this was really kind of an interesting man and his story. I went to an art show of Iraqi artists, and I came upon this painting. This is Ali al-Hamashi, and he's the artist who painted this. And I have to backtrack for a minute, because when I first arrived in Jordan, I hadn't begun working with the women yet. I hadn't met any of the refugees. It was like the second week I was there. And I wrote a poem, which I'll read to you right now. And the first line of the poem seemed very peculiar. I thought, where is this line coming from? But I just worked with it, and the poem is called Who Flees the City? The woman who flees the city carries a door on her back, and on the door is balanced a vase, and in the vase is rolled a scroll, and on the scroll is written a word, and in the word is folded a prayer, and in the prayer is flattened a heart, and in the heart is nailed a door which neither opens nor closes, carried by the woman who flees the city. And this painting, there's a door behind the woman. And the top of the door is marked with a red X. This woman, when a family is being threatened, they'll mark the door with an X, which basically, red mark, which basically says, you're our next target. And so they ran. And her husband was actually killed in the process, and she was left a widow. You can see she's pregnant there and with 2 children. And Ali al-Hamashi actually knows this woman and painted her. But when I saw the painting, I just thought, that's the woman I wrote the poem about, which was, I told Ali about it, and we were both blown away, and we ended up doing some collaborative work where he would paint paintings of the poems I wrote while I was in Amman, and I would write poems of his paintings. And it would be my dream to bring his work here and show it at the at UVU's Art Museum. This guy was so terrific. He was an art educator, and he was actually, the reason why his family came to Jordan is at the end of Saddam's regime, he had problems with his boss, and they were always sort of bickering with each other. And there was a big painting of Saddam in one of the schools, and his superior said, you need to touch this up, it needs some touch up. And Ali said, I'm not going to touch it up. The original painter needs to touch it up. I can't paint his work. And the superior was saying, if you don't do it, you're fired, and, blah, 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 blah. And Ali ended up saying, damn Saddam's painting. And the superior reported that he had said, damn Saddam. And they were after him. And so the family fled. And in Amman, he continues doing art education. This is an organization, CARE International, and they work with a lot of Iraqi and Palestinian refugee children. And this particular day, under Ali's supervision, they were painting murals on the building that they met in. This is Ali's daughter, Amir, and this is Mahmoud that I'm standing next to. He worked as my translator. He was a student at University of Jordan. I taught there for a semester, and he worked as my translator when Hala would go back and forth to Baghdad. These are the paintings that the kids did. This is the Iraqi flag, if you don't recognize. This little girl, Geda, she asked me not to take her picture, but I was filming this, and before the helicopters and the bombs and the crows were there, and I said, tell me about this. And she said, this is my uncle's garden. Every Friday, which is their Sabbath, every Friday we go and have a dinner together, and I get to play with all my cousins and hang out. And the next time I walked down the hall, she had painted the helicopters and the bombs and the crows. And I said, tell me about that. And she said, well, one Friday we were at my uncle's house and the bombs fell. And she said, and now nothing grows there. This little boy, it's kind of hard to see with the light, but he's painted a tank with 3 Americans in it. You could see they're firing artillery. It's hard to imagine that these kids, you know, if this is their experience as children and this is their memory of Iraq, they don't have the cognitive skills to make meaning of this or to give it any sort of perspective. Very, very traumatized kids. I love this little girl. She preferred abstract art, as you can see. And she was painting, and I kept saying, I wanted to interview her, and she was just so absorbed, just painting, painting, painting. She wouldn't pay any attention to me. And Mahmoud was trying to get her attention, and finally she turns around like this with her brush, and she just painted orange all over Mahmoud. And he screamed and jumped back, and she was giggling over that. Don't distract an artist from her work. These were the boys. Oh, they all wanted to be interviewed, telling me about their painting. Oh, and Doris Galbraith, who's the academic, I always get this wrong, administrative person for the English department. What's your title? She's not going to tell me. She and her nieces made about 500 bracelets for me to take. And she said, give these to the women you work with. And so I was giving it to all the girls here, and they were actually the boys too. Everybody wanted bracelets. And they were all grabbing them. I had a little bag, and I said, you know, shway, shway, wahi, just take one. And when I left, the 3 girls at the top, when I left the building at the end of the afternoon, they were outside waiting for the bus, and they all had bracelets all the way up their arms. This is one of Ollie's sons who painted this painting, and he said it was a picture. He said, I watched a show on National Geographic about the famine in Africa, and this is a picture of it. And here Amir painted this award-winning painting, which is the Iraqis won the soccer or football tournament international, and so this is called I Am Iraqi, and the guy's... Okay, let me talk a little bit about the challenges the women face. Employment. Although 40% of the Iraqi refugees are professional people, and having that many professional people leave the country, they call it the brain drain, because these are the very people who would most likely be able to contribute in a significant manner to the rebuilding and restructuring of a new government and a new social order. And these people cannot work illegally, as I've said, so they support themselves by working illegally, and this really sets the women up for exploitation because they're not paid minimum wage, and you know, they're overworked, and if they don't do what their employer says, you know, he can always threaten that he'll turn them into the immigration officers. They also use a little bit of their savings, but that is running out. Some money from relatives, some of them sell home crafts, have their children work, some of them receive charity. And then there's what's called weekend marriage or survival marriage. And in this situation, it's very shameful for a couple to have sexual relations outside of marriage. And so what they would do is a man would come and marry them for the weekend, and she would spend the weekend with him, and then they would divorce after the weekend. And then she could marry another man so that there's no dishonor or shame on his part. The health care. You know, although Iraqis can utilize Jordanian hospitals in emergency situations, most can't afford long-term care for chronic illnesses. And we saw a lot of untreated diabetes, cancer, and heart disease. And most utilize charity healthcare facilities, but there are so many refugees and so few charity hospitals that they can't accommodate everyone's need. And with the state of poverty these women are living in, they and their families are also dealing with malnutrition, which compromises the immune system. And the greatest problem I saw really was mental health. There's an overwhelming, all-pervasive sense of helplessness and hopelessness, well-founded, I might say. 10 minutes? Okay. Education. Roughly 50% of the refugees in Jordan are children, and 50,000 of those are of school age. Now, until the fall of 2007, Iraqi children were not allowed to legally attend schools. And this is because Jordan was just saying, you know, you're here for a time, you're moving on. And I might add, too, that Jordan really has been remarkably generous to these people. It's a poor country. They can barely provide for themselves, and to accommodate half again as many people. This would be equivalent to the United States taking in 150,000 refugees. What would that do to our economy? And, I mean, this is a terrible, terrible burden on Jordan, and yet they're allowing the people there. So until the fall of 2007, the children were not allowed to go to school, at which time the government says, okay, they're not going anywhere. Let's let them get into school. There'll be other problems if we don't. And at that time, it was expected that 35,000 children would be registered, but only 7,000 did register. And this means there's only 21,000 of the 50,000 school-age children that are actually attending school. The reasons why the children don't attend include the following. The parents may be there illegally, and they're afraid that if they register them, the government will be aware of their illegal status and that they'll be deported. They may be unable to access the necessary official papers that are required to register. The official papers, they can't just fax them from Baghdad. They have to go back to Baghdad and go through the bureaucratic process of getting the papers and returning. Many can't afford the 20 to 30 JD. A JD is like $1.40. So that's like $50 for the fees for primary and secondary education. Now, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees has made agreement with the Ministry of Education that it will cover their costs, but a lot of people aren't aware of this, and so they don't take the opportunity there. Many of the children are working, and the family cannot support itself without the income. The children are often teased. Jordan is a Sunni country. The majority of Iraqis are Shias. Saddam was Sunni, but he is in the minority there. And so when the children go to school, they can tell by their accents that they're Iraqis. And then they say, "How do you pray?" And there's different methods of, bowing and praying, and then they'll tease them and taunt them, and some, that can be pretty merciless. And they cannot attend school. They cannot go back to school if they've missed 3 years of schooling. Now, the war started when? 2003. It's now 2007. That's 4 years. There's a lot of kids who are out of school for 3 years, and they can't go back. Now, this is probably, in my perception, this is one of the major problems that the Iraqis face, the refugees, because here we've got a population of kids who have been traumatized by war enough that their parents have left the country that they are citizens of. So they've experienced the violence of war. They're not being educated, so they'll never really get a decent paying job to support themselves. They're in a country that isn't necessarily happy that they're there. They're not accepted socially. These are the very people who would be ripe for fanatic thought. And the system itself is creating this potential. Disruption of traditional family life, and Muslims are very traditional people in terms of the family and family relations. It is expected that the father provides for the family, but when the women are working, there's a lot of stress there with the role reversals. As I said before, increase in domestic violence. And it's interesting, not one of the women we interviewed, maybe I didn't say, we interviewed 70 women. Not one of the women I interviewed, in all of their families, not one person was engaged to be married because they couldn't afford it. Their lives were in such a state of limbo. But after a certain period of time, they're less marriageable. And so we've got a population of women who may never marry. And again, this disruption in the traditional family and what that means to them. Many of them are under continued threats. One family I worked with, this is a very, very serious story. He worked he worked with the U.S. military, and he infiltrated groups, antagonistic groups, and he actually was able to access their weapon stock. And he personally, along with his 3-year-old daughter, which he took with him because for cover, he personally transported 50 tons of weapons to the Green Zone. That's a lot of American lives he saved in that one act. And he was told, "We'll take care of you." And they didn't take care of him. And he's waiting to be resettled in a third country, but everyone knows his past. And he has been jumped 3 different times and attacked and beaten by strangers because they consider him a traitor, right? And then the negative attitudes of some Jordanians, as I said. And, okay, resettlement to third countries. The total of number of Iraqis who have resettled to a third country, and this is most of their goals. 80% of the women we talked with, they desired to be resettled in a third country. They said they simply could not go back. And then 20% said, in the future, maybe in 10 or 20 years, we can go back. The United States has accepted, guess how many they've accepted of these 2.5 million refugees? They've accepted 2,578. That's less than 0.001%. Last year, the United States anticipating taking in 7,000, but just over 1,000 were accepted. Sweden last year accepted 7,000. Sweden. Over 70,000 Iraqis collaborated with U.S. military forces and were promised resettlement. And again, 1.001% have been resettled in the United States. These 70,000 are likely to become very bitter in the fact that they collaborated and what they were promised never actually resulted. I'd like to talk. Oh, this is a diagram showing the percentage of the refugees that were resettled. The blue is the war, the 10 years prior to this war, and then you see that Sweden has taken the most, and the United States is on the far left there. Habibtis. I just wanted to show you some of the children of the families that we worked with. Beautiful, beautiful kids. There's my Habibis. These are some personal lessons I learned, and I'll just run very quickly over them. Israel is not the victim. You cannot have an atomic bomb and be the victim. The United States has never asked who the Iraqis are, and we're still not asking. And I think until we ask that question and listen for an answer, we won't know them enough to know how to assist in solving problems. I learned that what is not said is as or more important than what is said, and what is not seen is as or more important than what is seen. The most devastating war wounds are soul wounds. People who think they know God's will, and that they personally can carry out that will, are more dangerous than people with guns. People of the Spirit do not act or respond the way people of the world do. I learned that the world is simultaneously both larger and smaller than my perceptions of it. And the greatest threat to democracy is a lack of critical thinking skills and self-absorption on the part of its citizenship. And I believe that we as Americans woefully lack critical thinking skills and are woefully self-absorbed. I thought I'd end with a poem which I translated from one of the women I interviewed, who is a poet. And it's called "The Poem is Stronger." The poem is stronger than the stone, stronger than a small stone heart. But the stone's heart is full of honor. Just as a sculpture resides inside a stone, so the unwritten poem's beauty resides. When a sculpture is released from the stone, its beauty expands. On the stone margin of my poem, I have carved, "We are staying, we will not depart." Thank you. Shukran. Masalam. Thank you.